Welcome to a special bonus ArchiTreat, Food for Thought, sponsored by Friends of the Alabama Archives. Please remember before we begin to turn off or silence cell phones. Thank you. We invite you to plan now to join us next month on September 16th for our regular ArchiTreats program, which will feature Ed Williams presenting All the News That's Fit We Print, Community Journalism in Alabama. Today's speaker is no stranger to the archives. Recently retired as Professor of History at the University of Michigan, we are pleased that he has more time to participate in events here. He received his bachelor's degree with high honors from Princeton University and his doctorate from Yale. He has written several books on Alabama politics and the civil rights movement. Today's program is based on a special lecture presented in March of this year in England at the Cambridge Historical Society and is a rare opportunity for us to experience this prestigious lecture series. Now to present Alabama's Reconstruction Legislature, please welcome Niels Thornton.
Thank you, Sherry. The South's presidential Reconstruction state legislatures have not had a good press. Suspicious radical Republicans at the time thought them dominated by the former slaveocracy and secessionists. The black codes enacted by a number of them seemed to radicals, and not without good reason, to represent an effort to recreate slavery in another form. Modern scholars, beginning with W.E.B. Du Bois, have echoed these charges and have joined the radicals in regarding the legislature's membership and actions as proof of the fecklessness and racism of President Andrew Johnson's post-war policies. Yet few of these scholars have subjected the legislatures to close scrutiny. An examination of the personnel and proceedings of Alabama's legislature, for instance, must cause one at least to question many of the radicals' suspicions and may even lead the student to doubt the wisdom of the radicals' response to President Johnson's endeavors. Studies of presidential Reconstruction have universally failed to note the marked decline in the wealth and social standing of the men elected to the initial postbellum legislatures. But in Alabama, at any rate, nothing is more significant than this fact. Until the final dozen years of the antebellum period, Alabama's legislators had generally been men of relatively modest means. I have elsewhere explored the changing socioeconomic composition of the legislature before the Civil War. In 1830, the median legislative slaveholding was 9, and in 1840 it was 9.5. In 1830, half of the legislators were in the middle class of small slaveholders, that is, owners of 5 to 19 slaves, while planters, owners of 20 or more slaves, and members of the lower middle and lower grouping, that is, non-slaveholders and owners of 1 to 4 slaves, were each a fourth of the members. Large planters, or owners of 50 or more slaves, were only 7% of the total. By 1840, the increased social polarization that came with the advent of two-party competition had eroded the middle class's numbers from both above and below, so that planters, the middle class of small slaveholders, and the lower middle and lower class members were each a third of the legislators. The economic and geographical divisions within the state upon which the party system was built, focused as it was primarily on questions of banking and internal improvements, are apparent in the legislators' slaveholdings. Throughout this period, the median slaveholding of Whig legislators was double that of Democrats. But large planters were still only 10% of the membership. The rise of the Young America movement within the democracy in the years after the Mexican War had a marked effect on the wealth of Alabama legislators in the 1850s. The exacerbation of sectional tensions in national politics that flowed from Young America's enthusiasm for territorial aggrandizement and Young America's openness to internal improvements and economic modernization showed themselves in an increasing representation of planters among Alabama's lawmakers in the final antebellum decade. By 1850, the median legislative slaveholding had risen to 12.5, and by 1860, it had reached 17. In 1850, the lower middle and lower class and the middle class were again about a third of the legislators as they had been in 1840, but the proportion of large planters advanced from 10% of the members to almost 18%. And by 1860, the lower middle and lower grouping and the middle class had fallen in each case to about a fourth of the legislators, while planters were now half of the membership and large planters were a fourth of it. The devastation wrought by Civil War effectively burst this bubble of increasing legislative wealth that had characterized the 1850s and returned the lawmakers to the humbler status they had occupied for most of the antebellum era. This development seems to have begun in the Confederate general election of 1863, when secessionists suffered a widespread electoral repudiation. The median legislative slaveholding for legislators chosen in November 1865, as derived from the census of 1860, fell from 17 to only 8, even less than it had been in 1830. The median among representatives was 7, and among senators was 13. The lower middle and lower grouping now form some 40% of the legislators, and the middle class perhaps 30%. The percentage of members in the lower middle and lower classes was their largest proportion for any legislature for which I have figures. The percentage of former large planters, some 13%, was a bit above the comparable figure for 1840, but was substantially less than the proportions from the 1850s. In general, the legislators of presidential Reconstruction were poorer than they had been since the early antebellum years. Of course, all slaveholders were substantially poorer after emancipation, but the essential point is how much poorer the legislators of 1865-67 were than those of the final antebellum years, even when judged by 1860 standards. Another instructive insight into the effect of war and defeat on the electorate is the legislators' occupations. In the early antebellum decades, attorneys had been no more than 12 to 16% of the legislators, as against 70% or more who were engaged in agriculture. But by the 1850s, this balance had changed. In the final antebellum years, farmers fell to some 57 to 59% of the legislators, and lawyers rose to some 27% of them. This tendency reached its high point in the secession convention, when only 43% of the delegates were in agriculture and 37% were attorneys. And this rise in the proportion of lawyers had a most baleful effect. Opponents of immediate secession were a majority both among delegates who were farmers and among delegates who were neither farmers nor attorneys. But lawyer delegates favored immediate secession by 2 to 1. This differential reflected the extensive tendency of ambitious young attorneys to associate themselves with the increasingly influential faction within the Democratic Party led by William Lowndes Yancey, doubtless in part in an effort to further their careers. This disposition did not escape public notice. The same resentment that led to a decline in the wealth of the legislators chosen in November 1865 led also to new suspicions of attorneys. Though lawyers continued to be almost 29% of the Senate, they fell to only about 15% of the House, returning to a proportion comparable to that usual before the 1850s. However, doubts about planter influence kept legislators engaged in agriculture to only about half of the members in each House, far below their early antebellum proportion. The result, especially among the representatives, was a sharp increase in the diversity of the occupations to be found among the members. Physicians were 8% of the House and 14% of the Senate. Ministers were another 8% of the House, and merchants were 9% of it. Despite the continued power of the bar in the Senate, thus, attorneys' influence in the lower house was less than it had been for many years, and the diversity of occupations represented there was greater than at any previous time in the state's history. Two final aspects of the legislature's membership are also significant. The first is nativity. Essentially, all of the members were Southerners. Only 5 representatives and 3 senators had been born in non-slaveholding states. Georgians and native Alabamians together constituted a majority of each house, and the addition of the Carolinas and Tennessee accounted for more than 80% of the legislators in each body. Thus, virtually all of the members had grown up amid slavery and had known no other world. The second is the number of novice lawmakers in the legislature. The substantial electoral repudiation of legislators from the 1850s and early 1860s had necessarily brought into the body many men who were new to it. Some 45% of the senators and 73% of the representatives had never served in the legislature before. Both of these factors are important to remember as we turn to the legislature's struggles to adjust to emancipation, which had come to Alabama just 7 months before the members' election. The Constitutional Convention that met in September 1865 had formally abolished slavery in Alabama. Ironically, this very fact formed the principal argument against the ratification of the proposed 13th Amendment, forbidding slavery in the United States once the new legislature convened in November. Senator John N. Drake of Huntsville, who led the Senate opponents of ratification, told the upper house, because slavery had already been abolished in the South by the various state constitutional conventions, abolition could not have been the real goal of Congress in proposing the amendment. The actual intention of the congressional sponsors of the amendment, he argued, was to gain for the Congress, through the amendment's enforcement clause, the power to enact federal legislation governing the status of the freedmen and according them civil rights. The result would be, he said, to establish the black race on a firmer and broader basis than will be allowed to the white race. To deal with this objection, the House amended the ratification resolution by adding a reservation specifying that in ratifying, the legislature did not intend to confer on Congress the power to legislate upon the political status of the former slaves. With this proviso, the ratification resolution passed the House 75-17 and the Senate 23-5. And Alabama's ratification proved the crucial one, bringing the number of ratifying states to 3/4 and thus making the amendment a part of the Constitution. Though the opponents of the 13th Amendment had worried that it might transfer authority over the freedmen to the federal government, it is clear that the members of the legislature actually regarded the status of freedmen as a concern principally for the former planters in their body. The adjustment of the former slaves to free labor was a matter of desperate anxiety for large landowners, as it was for the freedmen themselves, of course. But for most of Alabama's whites, the war had left far more pressing matters in its wake. Substantial numbers were living on the food parcels given out by the U.S. Army. Even in late 1866, some 21,700 Alabamians, perhaps 10% of the state's families, were receiving federal relief supplies each month, with whites outnumbering blacks among them by 2 to 1. All of the state's banks had suspended specie payment, and only 2 had any prospect of resuming. Their banknotes in circulation were nearly worthless as a result. Debtors were in dire straits with virtually no way to meet their obligations. Creditors, consequently, were in almost equally difficult circumstances. The state government had very little income, and its institutions were struggling to function. The schools had ceased to do so at all. Railroads lacked the credit to rebuild their track, and turn to the state for endorsement of their corporate bonds. The legislature had before it proposals to try to meet each of these predicaments. A stay law to delay suits for debt, internal improvement schemes, bills both to authorize specie suspension and to punish the suspended banks, various suggestions for attempting to operate the schools or just for abolishing them, ideas for how to recreate the state's revenue system now that the principal source of antebellum taxes, the slaves, had been eliminated, radical proposals for retrenchment, and a proposal to issue state bonds to relieve the widespread destitution among the citizenry. All of these questions produced deep divisions among the legislators, and all of them seem much more urgent to most poorer white Alabamians than did the labor system on the plantations. As a result, in the early months of the new legislature's first session, the freedmen seem to have been the focus of attention, chiefly of better-to-do members. The committees on the freedmen established in each house reflected this situation. The chairman of the House Committee was the wealthy Montgomery planter Tristram B. Bethea, whose 221 slaves had made him the legislature's single largest slaveholder. 5 of the committee's 12 members had been substantial slaveholders, and 7 were from plantation counties. Similarly, the chairman of the Senate Committee was Aaron B. Cooper of the Black Belt County of Wilcox, who had owned 91 slaves. 5 of its 9 members had been extensive planters. Most of the bills reported from these committees: a ferocious bill to compel the freedmen to enter into labor contracts, a bill declaring any stubborn or refractory servant or any laborer who refused to comply with a labor contract without just cause to be a vagrant subject to being hired out to work on the county chain gang, an equally severe bill regulating black apprentices, a bill extending to every freedman all the highly discriminatory provisions of antebellum criminal law that had applied to free Negroes. All of these passed with little discussion by voice vote. The one bill that generated conflict, because it was the one with general implications for poorer whites, opened the courts to freedmen on the same basis as all citizens and permitted black testimony in cases in which a freedman was a party. Early efforts to get the legislators to take the rights of freedmen seriously were not hopeful. Senator Francis W. Sykes of Lawrence County in the Tennessee Valley, though he had owned 47 slaves in 1860, was one of the legislature's most racially liberal members and would become a founder of the state's Republican Party. At the outset of the session, he had introduced a bill to repeal all existing laws making a distinction of color. Senator Martin L. Stansel of Pickens, a Carrollton attorney, in an effort to convey his contempt for this proposal, moved to amend it to say, "except that distinction which has existed since the days of Japhet and the curse of Ham." In the face of such scorn, Senator Sykes' bill was tabled 16-11. 3 of the 11 who opposed tabling were future Republicans, while none of the 16 for tabling was. Though the chances initially looked bleak for an enlightened racial policy then, the outcome would be very different. The reversal turned upon the intervention of Governor Robert M. Patton. Patton, a Florence merchant and planter, had strongly opposed secession, but he had owned 117 slaves in 1860, and he certainly was not moved by any sense of racial egalitarianism. In his inaugural address, he had told Alabamians that it must be understood that politically and socially ours is a white man's government. In the future, as has been the case in the past, the state affairs of Alabama must be guided and controlled by the superior intelligence of the white man. And in his annual message in November 1866, he emphasized that the freedmen should be especially taught the utter absurdity of expecting or aspiring to a condition of social equality with the white race. To do so would be to struggle against a palpable and inexorable decree of providence. Nevertheless, Patton was deeply committed to paternalist ideals. "We have a high moral duty to perform towards the freedmen," he said in the same annual message. "Let them be convinced that we are their friends and that we feel an interest in their prosperity and welfare. They should be assured of our firm purpose to give them all of their legal rights." And in his initial annual message, he had lectured the legislators, "Surely no good law-abiding citizen will desire laws for the government of the unintelligent Negro, which he himself is unwilling to abide by. No good to the country can result from having one code of laws for the whites and another for the blacks in their new relations so far as concern the rights of persons and property." It was against this background that Governor Patton approached the massive legislation regulating the former slaves that had passed the legislature with so little dissent. Patton was inaugurated on December 13, 1865, and 2 days later the legislature adjourned for its Christmas recess, leaving the bills on the new governor's desk. When the lawmakers returned just after the new year, Patton greeted them with a flurry of veto messages. The bill governing black apprentices was class legislation, he told the House. The general provisions of the code on apprenticeships were ample regulation for all persons of both races. No legislation governing the labor contracts of the freedmen was necessary, he said to the Senate. The state already had general laws governing contracts, and the freedmen should be able to look to the courts to protect their natural rights without any discriminating statutes. And the bill extending the antebellum laws governing free Negroes to the freedmen would create absurd or inoperable results. One of them, for instance, would require almost all freedmen to leave the state. The gubernatorial objections had an electric effect. The bills that had passed with essentially no dissent now suddenly provoked the deep divisions that questions surrounding banking, internal improvements, and social reform always had. The House sustained the governor's veto of the black apprenticeships bill 42 to 51. Of the 51 voting to sustain the veto, 23 had been non-slaveholders, and an additional 15 had owned fewer than 10 slaves. Just 5 had been planters. Only 8 came from plantation counties, while 43 were from non-plantation counties. Of the 42 voting to override the veto, 15 had been planters, and only 7 had been non-slaveholders. 22 came from plantation counties and 20 from non-plantation counties. The economic and geographical divisions in the voting thus are clear. In addition, 8 of those voting to sustain the veto would become Republicans, while none of those voting to override would. The Senate sustained the governor's veto of the bill to compel freedmen to enter into labor contracts 15 to 18. Here the divisions of wealth were less clear. 6 former planters voted to override the veto and 6 to sustain it. But of the 18 voting to sustain the veto, 13 were from North Alabama and only 5 were from South Alabama. While of the 15 voting to override the veto, 9 were from South Alabama and 6 were from North Alabama. Only one senator, John Drake of Madison, who had led the fight against the 13th Amendment, voted to override the veto of the bill extending antebellum laws governing free Negroes to all freedmen. Throughout the antebellum era, legislators from the small farm counties had been on their guard against the specter of planter domination. Certain questions, such as taxation, had always aroused such feelings. Indeed, in the session of 1865-66 itself, as legislators searched for some revenue source to replace the tax on slaves and thus to allow the real property tax to remain low, planter legislators had hit upon the scheme of placing a high tax on the stills that throughout the hills turned the corn crop into liquor. The Revenue Act of 1866 placed a property tax on every still of $2 for every gallon of its capacity, and in addition, a production tax of 50 cents for every gallon distilled. Representative James Williams from the Appalachian County of Jackson railed at this levy. Planters, he said, have shaped the legislation of this session. and were half the membership of the Ways and Means Committee, which was an accurate allegation, incidentally. Rather than tax the great staple commodity cotton, they have shifted the burden on other men's shoulders, on those of my constituents, and on North Alabama generally, by imposing an onerous capitation tax and by taxing their little distilleries. If the poor pay the tax, fight the battles, hew the wood, and draw the water, certain it is a poor man in Alabama is not to be envied now. As Williams had predicted, the tax on distilling created an uproar across the hills and the Wiregrass, and when the legislature reconvened the following fall, at the urging of Governor Patton, it repealed the Revenue Act altogether and substituted a new one, eliminating the property tax on stills completely and reducing the production tax from 50 cents a gallon to only 5 cents. Well, it was precisely struggles such as this one that had formed Alabama's antebellum political culture, and the electorate fully understood their implications of culture and class. But these beliefs had not heretofore been extended across the barrier of race. In the days of slavery, black people as property were an element of wealth, to be envied or resented perhaps, but merely a symbol in the conflicts over white political equality. And the persistence of such attitudes towards blacks is apparent in the feeling widespread among less well-to-do legislators early in the session, as I have said, that the regulation of plantation labor was a concern of planters, but essentially irrelevant to the rest of the electorate. Governor Patton, in his veto messages, however, had placed the matter in a different light. He had called the bills class legislation because there were already general laws governing apprenticeships and contracts, and these additional bills sought to carve out a portion of the citizenry, at least as newly defined, to whom different and harsher regulations would apply. This was a logic that reached back to Jacksonian denunciations of special privileges for chartered corporations. And legislators from the small farming areas immediately grasped the threat. Planters who sought special regulations for their labor force were only too ready to seek special advantage in tax policies, for instance, as their actions in the revenue bill had clearly shown. Suddenly, the racial legislation became a matter of general concern. The one piece of legislation regulating the freedmen that did become law was the vagrancy bill, declaring all stubborn or refractory servants to be vagrants subject to the county chain gang. It had been signed by Provisional Governor Lewis Parsons before Patton took office. But even this act was not long for the statute books. Later in the session, the legislature passed a new state penal code. The new code contained its own non-racial vagrancy provisions, and it provided that all laws in conflict with it were repealed. The courts generally held, therefore, that the provisions of the new code had superseded the vagrancy statute. And to clarify the situation, the legislature at its second session formally repealed the vagrancy law. The only piece of legislation then left with restrictions on the freedmen was the law opening the courts to them and permitting them to testify if a black person were a party to the case. But this act, which passed only after a considerable struggle and no less than 2 conference committees, had actually represented a victory for more progressive members over more racially conservative ones. Future Republicans had supported it overwhelmingly through all of its versions against determined planter opposition. 11 of the 28 representatives who voted against the bill on final passage were planters, and every future Republican voting favored it. Governor Patton regarded the bill as such a success that he urged the legislature at its second session to eliminate all restrictions on black testimony, though the lawmakers were unwilling to reopen the question. The legislature enacted one other statute with clear implications for the freedmen, a law making it a misdemeanor punishable by a fine of up to $500 for one employer to lure away a worker under contract to another employer. But though this act certainly limited the ability of freedmen to seek better pay, its criminal penalties were only directed at whites. What was thus the essential defeat of the black code in Alabama is too seldom emphasized. And the failure to emphasize this defeat is especially regrettable because the circumstances that produced it also form the background to the rejection of the 14th Amendment at the legislature's second session. Let us now turn to that half of the story. As the first session of the legislature was coming to an end in February 1866, a joint committee co-chaired by future Republican Attorney General Joshua Morse of Choctaw County submitted an angry report denouncing the falsehoods propagated in the North and in Congress about Southern racial conditions, which it said were circulated only for the basest political purposes. It then submitted and the legislature adopted unanimously resolutions opposing the proposed 14th Amendment, which at that time was pending in Congress. Alabama will not voluntarily consent to change the adjustment of political power as fixed in the Constitution of the United States, and to constrain her to do so in her present prostrate and helpless condition, with no voice in the councils of the nation, would be an unjustifiable breach of faith. By the time the legislature reconvened for its second session the following November, the 14th Amendment had been formally submitted to the states for ratification. In his annual message, Governor Patton condemned it. Its provisions would vastly increase the power of the federal courts and submit state court decisions to the review of federal judges, he told the legislators, quite correctly. And unless the southern states agreed to enfranchise the freedmen, they would lose half their representatives in Congress. For those and other reasons, Patton urged the legislature to refuse to ratify it. Two different lines of response to the amendment quickly emerged. In the Senate, the racially liberal Lawrence County planter and physician Francis W. Sykes, seeking to save the amendment from Governor Patton's assault, proposed resolutions submitting the amendment to a popular referendum. A committee headed by future Governor Robert B. Lindsay reported adversely to the resolutions, and they were tabled 21-9. 3 of the 9 opponents of tabling filed a statement saying they had voted no merely to allow Senator Sykes to speak in support of his resolutions, but that they were opposed to them. Of the remaining 6, 4 were among the 5 members of the Senate who would become Republicans. Early in December 1866, just before the legislature was to take its Christmas recess, Governor Patton sent both houses a special message saying it had now become apparent that the Congress considered ratification of the 14th Amendment a prerequisite to readmission of the southern states to the Union. Under these circumstances, Patton suggested that the legislature might ratify to regain membership in Congress and then hope that the states' readmitted members could mitigate the amendment's effects in the future. In response, the Senate instead formally voted to reject the amendment, 28-3, with only 3 future Republicans supporting ratification. Francis Sykes once again sought a popular referendum on the amendment, but his proposal was tabled by voice vote. The Senate resolution refusing ratification then went to the House. The future Republican Attorney General Joshua Morse took up Sykes' idea and proposed a popular referendum on the amendment. But the proposal was rejected 49-24, and the resolutions refusing to ratify were then approved 71-9. Only one of the 9 supporters of the ratification had been a significant slaveholder, Prattville attorney Charles S.G. Doster, who would become a Republican. Of the other 8, 6 had been non-slaveholders, and the other 2 were owners of 10 and 2 slaves, respectively. The 24 representatives who had supported a popular referendum included only 2 planters, Doster and Nathan L. Brooks of Lowndes, about whom I will have more to say shortly. 9 of the 24 had been non-slaveholders, and another 9 had owned fewer than 10 slaves. With these votes, the idea of submitting the 14th Amendment to a popular referendum died, as did any prospects for ratification. In the meantime, however, another line of response to radical Republican demands was developing in the House. The leader of this effort was Nathan L. Brooks, a Lowndes County planter who had owned 54 slaves. Brooks's idea reached back to events at the State Constitutional Convention in September 1865. Alabama's Constitution of 1819 had provided that membership in both houses of the state legislature would be apportioned among the counties on the basis solely of white population. And under this constitutional mandate, the small farming counties had dominated the legislature throughout the antebellum period, to the great chagrin of the plantation counties. But with the emancipation of the slaves, delegates to the 1865 Constitutional Convention from the plantation counties had seen the prospect of changing this situation. Now that blacks were free, they argued, legislative representation should reflect their numbers. Plantation county delegates pushed hard for apportionment on the basis of total population. But the Constitutional Convention was itself apportioned on the white basis, and the black belt efforts had proven futile. The Constitution of 1865 simply repeated the apportionment provisions of the Constitution of 1819. The 14th Amendment section reducing the state's congressional representation by the proportion of their disfranchised male population offered Representative Brooks the chance to reopen this question, however. His initial proposal was to amend the state constitution to permit literate freedmen to vote. This change would have the immediate effect of blunting the reduction of congressional representation under the 14th Amendment, and in the longer term could provide the foundation for seeking increased legislative membership for the black belt counties. The House tabled this amendment 72-16. 4 of the 16 filed statements saying they had voted against tabling because they were so completely opposed to the amendment that they wanted to vote against it on the merits. Of the remaining 12, 6 were from the black belt, all of whom had been large slaveholders, and 5 of the other 6 were from the hill counties, 4 non-slaveholders and 2 small slaveholders. Despite its overwhelming defeat, therefore, Brooks's proposal had begun to draw together exactly the sort of coalition for which he clearly was aiming. Black belters who sought greater legislative influence for their area, and Hill County progressives sympathetic to the ideas of the emerging Republican Party. Brooks and his allies therefore pressed on. Their next effort came after the legislature's return from its Christmas recess, when they pressed a proposal to submit to the voters the question of whether to call a new state constitutional convention. A convention, of course, would allow the reconsideration of both the suffrage and the legislative apportionment provisions. On this initial try, the House tabled the resolution 51-30. Of the 30 members who supported Brooks's position, 11 were planters and 14 were non-slaveholders, 4 of them, or owners of 10 or fewer slaves. 12 came from plantation counties and 18 from non-plantation counties. But, in fact, Brooks's opponents represented the coalition that Brooks was attempting to build almost as well as his supporters did. 19 were from plantation counties and 32 from non-plantation counties. It is clear that Brooks both had failed to unify the plantation counties' representatives behind his strategy, and especially had failed to draw many of the poorer members to his cause. Moreover, though 3 of the future Republicans in the House supported him, 5 voted with his opponents. The challenge that Brooks faced was twofold. He had to convince the planters that they would be able to control a black vote in their counties, so that in gaining additional representation for their areas, they would not find themselves voted out of office. This evidently was Brooks's own belief, so that he could make this argument to his black belt challengers with sincerity. At the same time, however, probably in quieter conversations with representatives from the Hill counties and the Wiregrass, he would have had to have made the case that enfranchised blacks would vote with poorer whites in defense of egalitarian policies and in opposition to planter hegemony. This, for Brooks, was certainly a more disingenuous claim. But the fears felt by many planters of the enmity of their former slaves was exceeded only by small farmers' general conviction that the planters would be able to manipulate the votes of their black dependents. Thus, Brooks was placed in the position of having to advance to the two different constituencies precisely contradictory predictions of blacks' possible behavior if he were to draw them to the support of his bill. Unless he could overcome both sets of white fear simultaneously, he had no hope of building the coalition he sought. And without such a coalition, he had no prospect of allaying the suspicions of the radicals in Congress and forestalling their draconian plans. Brooks's third and final effort came at the end of the legislative session. By that time, military reconstruction was pending in Congress, and Brooks clearly felt that the changed circumstances might lead enough legislators to reconsider their position that his ideas might now be accepted. Thus, in mid-February 1867, Brooks rose to seek a suspension of the rules to permit him again to propose a referendum on summoning a new state constitutional convention. He did do a bit better on this try, but the House again voted him down 34-45. The number of planters who supported Brooks's position fell from 11 to 7, while the number of non-slaveholders who voted with him rose from 4 to 10. Apparently, the growing strength of radical sentiment in the North had increased both planters' fears and at least some white small farmers' confidence in the prospects for an independent black electorate. 11 of the 34 members supporting Brooks came from plantation counties and 23 from non-plantation counties. But only 12 of the 30 members who had voted with Brooks on the earlier roll call remained with him on this one. 11 planters voted against Brooks now, along with 14 non-slaveholders and an additional 14 small slaveholders. 16 of his opponents came from plantation counties and 29 from non-plantation counties. And so Brooks's last effort failed, and with it any prospect that the legislature might seek to accommodate radical demands. Well, it is surely an irony of the darkest hue that the same social attitudes that had produced the legislature's rejection of a black code produced also its inability to compromise with the radical suspicions. But that is the case. When Governor Patton warned that acts imposing disparate regulations on the freedmen constituted class legislation, poorer legislators joined overwhelmingly to sustain his vetoes. They fully understood the danger of creating special exceptions to general provisions of law to benefit the planters or other wealthy elements. This fear had been the central emphasis of Jacksonian politics, and the consequences of excessive planter influence had been starkly accentuated by the death and destruction of the war, which had produced the extensive repudiation of late antebellum leadership in the election of this very legislature. On the other hand, the dread of planter domination was equally at work in the prospect of eliminating the white basis for legislative apportionment and the resultant transfer of seats from the Hill counties and the Wiregrass to the Black Belt. Even an independent black electorate would have interests substantially different from those of white small farmers, but it was not independence that most Hill County legislators actually expected. They foresaw, and the history of Alabama in the latter decades of the 19th century fully substantiated their fears, they foresaw a black vote subject to planter manipulation, whether through economic pressures or physical intimidation. The hostility to planter power underlay both small farmer legislators' rejection of the 14th Amendment with its provisions intended to push the Southern states into enfranchising the freedmen, and the repudiation of the possibility of such an enfranchisement itself in the form of Nathan Brooks's efforts to summon a new constitutional convention or to amend the Constitution to authorize it. There can be no doubt that the radicals in Congress had no real understanding of the subtleties of social conflict in the Lower South. A great many of them were afflicted with a romantic faith in democracy that led them to believe that black enfranchisement would solve the region's problems at a single stroke. Virtually none of them appreciated that the addition of blacks to the electorate would represent, for a state like Alabama, a massive intrastate sectional shift in legislative and political influence from the small farming counties to the plantation counties. Indeed, almost all radicals thought that planters controlled Southern politics already and understood themselves to be attacking rather than threatening to strengthen planter influence. But legislators from Alabama's hills and wiregrass were under no such illusions. We can certainly imagine measures that might have established an independent black electorate, but that would have required a permanent occupying army sufficient to protect black voters from reprisals and an implacable refusal of amnesty for the planters' leadership. The number of Northerners prepared to maintain such measures on a long-term basis was vanishingly small. And given that the number of Southern whites who accepted the legitimacy of independent black electoral participation was almost equally minuscule, it was by no means unreasonable for small farmer legislators to regard the enfranchisement of the freedmen as a step towards planter rule of the state. It is impossible today not to sympathize with those great-hearted Americans who sought full citizenship for the freedmen. But however noble their goals, they reckoned without a sufficient appreciation of the force of history. A society that had assumed the naturalness of slavery for more than 2 centuries and that had experienced black freedom for only a matter of months could hardly have been expected to grasp the full possibilities of emancipation. And it is surely that chasm of white incredulity that more than any other single factor condemned radical Reconstruction to failure. The widespread violence and fraud that suppressed the black vote during radical Reconstruction itself, and the electoral machinations of the Redeemers to crush white small farmer resistance thereafter, both reflected the general white conviction that blacks were not and were incapable of becoming authentic partners in democratic decision-making. Theirs was, as they said repeatedly, a white man's government. Nevertheless, the voting in the presidential Reconstruction legislatures emphasizes another and equally significant truth. Though the legislators from the small farming counties were certainly not open to any recognizable notions of racial equality, their strong sense of class conflict and the threat posed by their planter rivals could bring them to positions that had positive racial implications. The outcome was, of course, an especially important element in the populist revolt. But as the defeat of the Black Code demonstrated, this potential had been present from the beginning. Its sources stretch back to the battles of the Jacksonian era. The white small farmers' beliefs very rarely extended to an acceptance of black social equality. But when racial discrimination encompassed behavior that threatened the equal citizenship of poorer whites, wealthier political forces could very suddenly find themselves confronted with incensed small farmer opposition. The emergence of the one-party system after Reconstruction deprived these attitudes, except for the brief period of populism, of the institutional structure that could otherwise have given them full scope for their expression. But they had always been there. A recognition of this fact is essential to a complete understanding of the patterns of Southern history. Thank you.